Hello once again and welcome to the Space Nuts podcast, episode 263. My name's Andrew Dunkley, your host, and today on the program, a warning from NASA that the moon is approaching a cycle that, when combined with climate change, might see some high tides exceeding flood thresholds. And they're not talking the distant future either. It's pretty soon. And the InSight mission on Mars has revealed clues about Mars Quakes and the core of the red planet. They think they've got that figured out, and it's quite astounding. Plus audience questions. We'll hear from Ollie in South Australia. He wants to know what knocked Uranus flat on its back and where that thing is now. And Matt from Chattanooga is asking questions about that recent Virgin Galactic flight and how they attained zero G, and was it a free fall or something to that effect, and the whys and wherefores of the trip. So we will revisit that. As usual, joining me is astronomer at large, Professor Fred Watson. Hello, Fred.
Hi, Andrew. Good morning. This morning as we record this, so I can say good morning.
Yes. Now I'm in a different location today. Do you love my teal wall? What do you think of that?
It looks like a green screen. Yeah, it looks like a green screen that for you getting a good background on TV there. Yeah,
it does,
nice.
Doesn't it? It's just somebody painted the entire office that I work in teal. If I turned the camera around and showed you every wall in the place, they'd all be that colour. It's rather dreadful.
Yes.
But anyway, we carry on regardless. Now, Fred, how are you going with lockdown and isolation?
Yeah, we're still in isolation here, thanks to going to buy a bottle of milk in the wrong shop at the wrong time a week last Saturday. It turned out that that particular Woolworths was a contact point. It turned into a hotspot, which means that we got pinged by New South Wales Services New South Wales and said, "Yeah, you're in isolation now, mate. Get tested twice more. In fact, we've been tested 3 times altogether. The final one's tomorrow. But out of lockdown at the weekend. Sorry, out of isolation at the weekend. However, the Sydney area is still in lockdown, and we're just hearing this morning reports of cases of COVID-19 in our local area, which is even nearer than where we were before. So we'll be out of isolation with nowhere to go, Andrew.
That's unfortunately the case, and my boys are down there as well, and they've been locked up for quite a while now, and they've got a bit longer to wait. They're very lucky though that they can work from home, so they can at least keep themselves fairly occupied. But
we're the same.
This outbreak is just not showing any signs of winding back, and that's the tragedy of it. So hopefully they'll haul it all in, and things will get back to normal soon. But at the moment, it's terrible. Okay, Fred, let's get down to business. We'll start off with this warning from NASA that the moon is approaching a cycle which, when combined with the climate change issues that the planet is facing, will see high tides exceeding flooding thresholds in some parts of the world. Now, they're talking the mid-2030s. This is quite astonishing.
Yes, that's right. It's nothing new as far as the astronomy is concerned. What we've got is a situation where astronomy and climate change are coming together, if I can put it that way. So the moon, it goes through various cycles. The one we all know is the monthly cycle. That's why we call it a month, because once a month the moon goes round in its orbit around the Earth. But the orbit itself undergoes other cycles as well. And in particular, there is an 18.6-year cycle that is to do with the precession of the moon's orbit. Now, I think we've talked about the precession of the Earth's axis before, and that's something easy to understand. If you think of the Earth as a big spinning top, it's spinning, rotates once every 24 hours, but its axis is also rotating around, just like a spinning top does, and that's called precession. In the case of the Earth's axis, it goes around once in 26,000 years. So it's a much longer period phenomenon. But the moon's orbit around the Earth does that too. If you think of the orbit as being in a flat plane, and then imagine a perpendicular to that plane, it's that perpendicular that's precessing very slightly around a pole, a bit like the Earth's axis does, and that's an 18.6-year cycle. Right. And what it does is it changes the moon's orbit, not by much. It's certainly nothing you'd notice with the naked eye, but it changes it enough to affect the moon's influence on the tides on Earth. And so what happens is that sometimes during that 18.6-year cycle, you get high tides being a bit lower and low tides being a bit higher, which means the range is getting smaller. But at other times, kind of, the other half of the cycle, if I can put it that way, the high tides are higher and the low tides are lower. And that's what NASA scientists, along with scientists in the University of Hawaii, have raised an alert on, not to be alarmist, but to make the point that what this has, its practical effect is that low-lying coastal areas will have more of these things that are sometimes called nuisance floods where you've got a really high tide, and it floods the streets of the coastal areas. There will be more of those. That's the point that they're making, and in particular, this is likely to be the case from the mid-2030s for a few years. And so what they're saying is not, this is a terrible situation, we're all going to die. It's not that. It's about advising city planners and local authorities that look after the flood protection on coastlines and things of that sort. All of these people who need to know that we're likely to see more of these events in the 2030s.
What about low-lying places like the Maldives that are only like 1 or 2 meters above sea level? What sort of an impact would it have on places like that?
Yes, exactly. So they're also places that are at risk because you might not get. It won't be dramatically that much higher than it is now, but it'll be more often. It might be. It's probably still a fraction of a meter that we're talking about, the difference, but it will happen more often.
Yeah. We've heard of king tides happening fairly regularly.
And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Yeah.
Right. So maybe bigger king tides is what we're talking about.
That's exactly it. So technically, a king tide. So a spring tide is when the moon and the sun basically are in the same direction. So you get higher and lower tides. A king tide usually is that combined with meteorological effects, which, if you get a low pressure region, then the tide comes up higher. So you get these king tides. It's nothing like a tsunami. It's not that kind of thing we're talking about. It's just an increase in the tidal range. What I guess concerns me or interests me about this is that with sea level rise, that is a process that's going to continue for a very long time. So when we get to the next phase of the moon's precessional period, which will be in the 2050s, we're probably going to get even more effects from this. So the 2050s, we're going to see much more of these coastal intrusions of water. So it's a good warning. It's actually come from ocean scientists as well as astronomers. This work, it's been done very careful work. It's easy to find the reports on it. They've taken the results from many oceanographic studies and folded them into what we know about the effect of tides and the moon's orbit. So it's a well meant and well-placed warning.
Yes, indeed. And it looks like their projections go right out to about 2080. So they've got a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. I would imagine that if you're in the 2030s and one of these, super king tides, I suppose they'll end up calling them in journalism, starts to happen at the same time as you get a a massive low pressure system and a tropical storm of some kind in the same area, I can imagine what that would do.
That's
so
right.
Let's hope that doesn't happen.
The warning. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Very interesting stuff. And you can actually look up that paper. I think it's available through NASA. It's widely published, so it shouldn't be difficult to find. By the by, Fred, I used to live in Mackay in North Queensland. Judy and I moved up there just after we got married. Now, they have king tides. They have playing fields around some of the beaches there, and quite often they'll go a couple of feet underwater when they have a big tide.
Yeah.
And the real interesting thing that they've done in Mackay to try and alleviate some of these tidal surges is that they have built channels in the city that when you get a big tide comes in, the channels fill up so the land doesn't go under. We used to live in a house that had these channels behind them, and it sometimes was full to the brim of seawater.
Wow.
And then 6 hours later it was empty. It was fascinating, quite fascinating. But so that's how some places... Yeah. Especially because it moves so fast. When the tide's going out, that water actually goes in a rush. And it's a different world up there. I mean, I grew up around the Newcastle area where the tides were pretty mild. Meagre would be the word, and to be the same in Sydney. But up in Mackay, you could actually walk with the incoming tide. It was really fascinating.
Wow.
Very slow walking pace, but it came in that fast. So, and I know there are other parts of the world where it actually comes in like a wave. So, it's really, I find that kind of influence of things like the moon on our waterways here just quite intriguing. I do find it amazing. And I've witnessed some pretty amazing tides and king tides over the years too. You are listening to the Space Nuts podcast with Andrew Dunkley and the good Professor Fred Watson.
Space Nuts. You've been listening to the Space Nuts podcast. Available at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast player. You can also stream on demand at Bytes.com.
This has been another quality podcast production from Bytes.com.